Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and many thanks to the organisers, particularly Charlie, for organising today. Events like this are so important because, as we know, we're all in this together, so of course we have to come together. Not that long ago, people were discussing whether AI is a good or bad thing. And I think we're past that now. I think we all agree that AI is here to stay, for good or bad, so we're going to have to deal with it. So I've been asked to give a Jewish perspective, and I'm going to do that by looking at a single ancient practice, and that's the Jewish Sabbath, the Shabbat, the weekly day of rest. Before that, I should say a little bit about my background. I am a rabbi, but my day job is actually a barrister. I'm a commercial barrister. And I've also just been made the chair of a network called AI and Faith, which is based in the States. Some of you may have heard of it. Some of you may be advisors on it. I can see a few here. Do join that. Do have a look and join that. My overarching point for today is that Shabbat provides a useful test case to show how religious ideas and ritual can assist us in integrating AI positively into our lives. And you don't need to be Jewish, you'll be glad to know, or even religious to appreciate this. So before going into the weeds, let me just briefly explain what Shabbat is and why I think it's a useful lens through which to consider AI. So Shabbat is the institution. It's observed by Jews each week from sunset on Friday to nightfall on Saturday. And during this day, work is prohibited. So it's a day spent with the family, with friends, and with the community. The literature on what constitutes work is complex and it's vast. But essentially, Jewish law prohibits 39 categories of creative labor on Shabbat. Examples include writing, lighting a fire, or completing the production process for an item. You may ask what that means, and it's a very complex question. In the modern period, it was decided that technologies using electricity fall into some of these categories, which means that Orthodox Jews don't use phones or computers on Shabbat, so no AI for one day a week. I should also say that Shabbat isn't just another ritual, but actually plays a central role within Judaism. For starters, it's one of the 10 commandments, so it's right up there with don't kill and don't steal. The 19th century Hebrew writer known as Achad Ha'am once said that more than the Jewish people kept Shabbat, Shabbat kept the Jewish people. And having observed Shabbat for all my life, I can say that I think that's correct. Why is it a useful concept to consider AI? Well, because it directly addresses questions around creation and rest from technology. So let me turn to that. Many people respond to technological overload with what might be called voluntary withdrawal. Digital detoxes, screen-free weekends, mindfulness retreats. A good example of this is the artist and filmmaker Tiffany Shlain, who coined the term Tech Shabbat and wrote the book 24/6, The Power of Unplugging One Day a Week. Now, voluntary withdrawal can help, but digital detoxes, screen-free weekends, and mindfulness retreats rarely last. And why is that? Well, because they're individual solutions to systemic pressures. What interests me about Shabbat is that it's not a lifestyle choice, but a lived philosophy involving law and story, ritual, and community. For one day a week, an entire community agrees to stop certain forms of activity, not because they're harmful in themselves, but because limits matter. So turning to the philosophy of Shabbat, let me introduce you to four short ideas, which I think are also relevant to AI. So my first idea is that creation requires rest. In Exodus, the Hebrews are told, as part of the 10 Commandments, remember Shabbat and keep it holy, because God made heaven and earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh. The creation story says that God creates the world and then stops. That stopping is described as completion. Creation, therefore, requires stopping, not because of exhaustion, but because the goal of creation lies beyond the activity of creating itself. Stopping allows us to ask what it is that we're creating for and how creation meets those goals. My second idea is about freedom. It's that freedom requires distance. In Deuteronomy, when Moses repeats the story of the giving of the Ten Commandments, the focus is freedom from slavery. The wording is slightly different to the Exodus text that we just looked at. And here the Hebrews are commanded to observe Shabbat and ensure that even slaves rest because you were a slave in Egypt and God freed you. So Shabbat is linked to liberation from slavery. The key insight, I think, is not historical, but actually psychological. The enslaved person can't see the system that they're trapped in. You don't know you're trapped in the system because the system defines what counts as normal. And this phenomenon exists, unfortunately, in all types of abuse. Automation, I would argue, carries a similar risk. It saves time and it increases convenience, but it makes it hard for us to see what technology is actually doing to us. And Shabbat creates a recurring vantage point outside the system. My third idea involves a Shabbat law relating to tools. As I mentioned, Shabbat prohibits work as defined. Work often requires using tools. One of the laws of Shabbat, instituted by the rabbis as an additional measure, is a prohibition not just on using tools, but actually also on moving tools, such as hammers or pens or computers. And that law is called in Hebrew muksa, which means separated. Muksa is the practice of deliberately setting parts of the world beyond use. And this signals that not everything exists merely to be operated, to be optimized or controlled. By setting tools aside, we come to see how tools shape our lives. And here, modern philosophy offers a helpful parallel. You have on the slide in front of you a photograph of Martin Heidegger, who also happens to be a Nazi sympathizer as well as a philosopher, but nevertheless, I'm quite attracted to some of his writings. He distinguished between tools we use without noticing and tools we notice only when they break. Now, most of the time, technology disappears into the background, and that's precisely when tools shape us the most. So I would like to suggest that through this law of muksa, this law of not moving particular tools, Shabbat introduces us to a different type of interruption, not through failure or breakage, but through an enforced non-use. For one day, tools are allowed to exist without being instruments. This matters for AI because AI systems are increasingly embedded and therefore increasingly invisible to us. So we need to separate from our tools in a way that allows us to see how they shape us. So now I'm going to move on to my fourth idea, and I'm going to return to the idea of creation. And a concept found in medieval Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah. Sorry if I'm going one step deeper, but I hope you're finding this interesting. In the 16th century, Jewish mystics developed a notion called tzimtzum. It's quite a nice word, and it means contraction. The tzimtzum is an answer to a very particular question, and that is, how can an infinite God who's everywhere create a finite world? And the answer of the Kabbalists is that God withdraws into him or herself through this process of tzimtzum, contraction, and thereby creating an empty space or a void in which the world with all its messiness can exist independently of God. In other words, the act of self-limitation made human freedom possible. Now, AI isn't God, but it may need to restrict some of its power so that we can retain our freedom. Because power that doesn't restrain itself eliminates the freedom of other people. And this insight, I think, translates surprisingly well into AI ethics. There's a nicely entitled article called The Humble Creative Machine by Christopher Cassion, Maya Ackerman, and Anna Jordanes. Maya, by the way, has just published a book on creativity and AI. And in this article, they propose that AI be designed to act humbly by withholding some of its capacity so that humans can flourish. They want AIs to be humble creative machines, which I think is a lovely term. And they write that the humble creative machine should lead its users to independence and gradually adjust its level of interaction and quality of outputs to meet the user's level of expertise. And this, I would suggest, is Simpson as applied to AI. So just to summarize where we're up to so far, here are the 4 ideas which I draw from Shabbat. Number 1, creation requires rest because the goal of creation lies beyond the activity of creating. Number 2, focused on the source from Deuteronomy, that freedom requires distance. So think slavery. We need a recurring vantage point outside the system to view the system. Number 3, tools should be set aside sometimes because we need to be reminded that not everything exists to be operated or optimized or controlled. And fourthly, powerful things like AI, and God indeed, need to withhold their power to make room for others, and think here about humble machines. And now I want to turn to address a question often posed about AI, and that is, what will humans do all day when machines do everything to us? And of course, we've heard a lot recently about the future of work, so this question is coming up more and more. And it's a very old question, in fact. We've been asking this question from the beginning of time, really. For millennia, work was seen as a bad thing. Adam ate of the tree of knowledge. What was his punishment? If you recall, in Genesis, by the sweat of your brow shall you get bread to eat until you return to the ground. So Adam was going to have to work. That's a bad thing. Hesiod, the Greek poet, describes in one of his works early humans dwelling in bounteous ease, suggesting, perhaps like Genesis, that leisure is the best thing. Later, Aristotle also thought that the purpose of physical work was to provide leisure. And if you can get someone else to do it, like a slave, well, that's great. In the 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution, machines allowed for more work, but for most people, it didn't give rise to more leisure. Marx thought that industrialization could be used to reduce work hours, but was more interested in improving the quality of work. John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, preached the gospel of leisure. He wanted us to use technology to gain more free time. In contrast, Thomas Carlyle, another philosopher, preached the gospel of work. He thought leisure was a bad thing. Keynes, the economist, said that by 2030, we would have a 15-hour working week, which would leave us loads more time for leisure, and that was going to be great. But then in the 1980s came burnout in the West, and hikikomori, this extreme social withdrawal in the East, particularly in Japan. And yet now in 2026, we're worried again about having no work at all, and we're also worried that even our hobbies may be taken from us. There's a scene, I don't know if you've seen the film, of the 2008 film, WALL-E, yes, of this future, in which humans are depicted as flying around in this kind of Noah Ark-like spaceship, the Axion. There's been a climate disaster on Earth, and what they're doing all day, well, they're basically watching TV and drinking milkshakes and taking video calls, and that's our fear. So there's a real question, when all work and striving stops, what remains meaningful? Shabbat actually is an experiment in this regard. It gives us an opportunity to explore that question because it's a day where work is actually impossible if you follow the law. Any work that's necessary, and this may sound very strange if you've never kept it, including cooking or setting the lighting, people use time switches to deal with the lighting, has to be done and prepared, in the case of food, before sundown on Friday. So everything is already done. It's a very strange type of being. And in fact, the rabbis saw Shabbat as a taste of the world to come. So here's an ancient midrash you can see on the screen. So it's an ancient bit of rabbinic text, where one rabbi says that sleep is a microcosm of death, A dream is a microcosm of prophecy, and Shabbat is a microcosm of the world to come. So what's the world to come? Well, it could be an afterlife, or it could mean a messianic world, a messianic future where everything is taken care of, such as a future perhaps dominated by AGI. So what do people do on Shabbat, you may ask, to fill the gap left by work, which has a very wide definition, right? So in the Talmud, the sages advised on how we might divide our time on Shabbat. Half of it should be spent studying Torah, that's Jewish law and text, and half should be spent enjoying Shabbat through food, drink, and sleep. In other words, half for God, this is the way the rabbis describe it, and half for human beings. So let me just briefly outline some of these things. Learning. One might wonder how the act of learning, I mentioned this is time dedicated to God, how that could be. And the point here is that within Judaism, learning is not just about gaining knowledge, but it's actually devotional. It's about self-transformation. It's about engagement. And it's about leading to an understanding of and connection with the divine. Now, AI provides us with a universe of unlimited knowledge. But is that enough? And what I suggest is that viewing the act of learning as devotion protects us from the encroachment of other intelligences and ring fences our humanity. At stake is not knowledge, as I said, but self-formation through the cultivation of wisdom and connection with the all. And then we have physical pleasure. And this is an interesting one. So the Talmud that I mentioned or brought mentions food and drink and sleep. The rabbis also suggest that Shabbat is a time for intimacy, for sex. And in fact, the Talmud actually outlines different professions and when they should be having sex and suggests that ask the question, when is the ideal time for Torah scholars to fulfill their conjugal obligations? I like that term. And Reb Judah's answer in the name of Shmuel is on Friday night. We know that there are 4 categories of human needs. There's food, there's shelter, there's clothing, and there's communication. And Shabbat accentuates the sacred nature of these and other activities. And it also adds into the mix the need to have joy. Just to quote sort of one code of Jewish law, it says that Shabbat, there's a command of delight in Shabbat, as explained by the prophets, and you shall call the Sabbath a delight. So you're meant to be happy on that day. It's also a day which accentuates the communal. There's a law that actually, the law about working, many people know, but there's another law that actually you can't walk 2,000 cubits outside the city perimeter. That's approximately 1 kilometer outside the city, which forces people, of course, to live within a distance close to other people of the community, and it creates communal cohesion. Humans are social by nature. So Shabbat, therefore, acts as a reminder of what is important to us. Even in an age of AI, humans will remain intelligent, they'll remain social, and they will remain embodied. We'll still crave wisdom and learning, companionship, food, rest, and loving touch. Shabbat reminds us that these things are core to our humanity and so need to be preserved. Now, none of this answers the questions whether this is enough to keep us happy when work disappears, and I suspect it won't. There's an article entitled The Goods of Work, Other Than Money, which argues that work is a privileged context for individuals to pursue excellence by developing their skills, to make a social contribution, to receive social recognition, to be in community with people with whom they stand in relatively free and equal relationship. Shabbat may be able to speak to some of these things, but I don't think it speaks to all of them. Moreover, the rabbis were mindful that the command to keep Shabbat starts with the words, 6 days shall you work. So they say work is imperative. And they warn of the dangers of idleness, as demonstrated by the following. This is, again, a early medieval rabbinic text. Rabbi Yehuda ben Batera said, if someone has no work to do, what should he do? If he's got a dilapidated yard or field, he should go and work on them. As it says, 6 days shall labor and do all your work. So, by the way, although the text refers to men, there are other texts which see idleness in women as particularly problematic, but that's for another day. The interesting thing about this text is that work doesn't necessarily need to be productive. There's no suggestion that this dilapidated yard is needed. The issue is more just simply not being idle. One could add that work also means any type of creative endeavor. So sculpting, painting, drawing, writing. And without paid work, therefore, maybe we all need to become creators. Now, you may say, well, not everyone's good at art or likes to be creative. But we may discover that it doesn't really matter how good we are, especially as the machines are likely to be better than us in everything. It's actually the act of doing art, of making art, that will count. And what is, in fact, art? No one quite captures the essence of art like Rainer Maria Rilke, the poet, who advises a young poet about art and says, depict your sorrows and desires, passing thoughts and the belief in some sort of beauty. Describe all these with loving, quiet, humble sincerity, and use to express yourself the things in your environment, the images from your dreams, and the objects of your memory. So this is what may be left to us when work, as we know it or think of it, usually disappears. And so, to conclude, Shabbat teaches that humanity is rooted in wisdom, connection, and embodiment, and it also highlights the importance of creative labor because Shabbat's not meant to be a permanent state. Every Shabbat is preceded and followed by 6 days of work. So overall, Shabbat isn't an escape from technology. It's a training ground for living wisely with it. I suppose it's a kind of weekly rehearsal for the kind of world that we hope to create. I hope you found that interesting. Thank you very much.
So, we have time for questions.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much, Harris. I really appreciate the richness of what you're talking about. I'm struck, however, by how it contrasts so starkly with some of the dominant discourse around AI that I would pair this in opposition to Peter Thiel's Antichrist lectures. If you're familiar with his position in that, is the accelerationist view is everything. Anything that slows that down, anything where we take care and consideration over our use of technology, or we restrict the monarch figure of AI, is the Antichrist. And he cites specific people like Greta Thunberg, anyone who regulates, anyone who restricts. So given, and I don't want to be rude, but given that Peter Thiel has more influence than you.
What?
Sorry, I'm being brutally honest. But we know he has more influence, specifically on the US government and worldwide. How does your more valuable approach to this, how does that get disseminated and deal with these dominant discourses?
Well, I turn to what the bishop said earlier. I mean, we're going to have to come together, aren't we? And every religion has its USP or USPs, right? So I picked one which I think is uniquely Jewish, right? This kind of forced day of rest. But the Christian tradition has very strong tradition in silence, slow reading, all these kind of things. So we can come together around that and we can promote that. And I think people can relate to when you talk about relationships. I mentioned this symptom, right? Very particular niche Kabbalistic term, but we could all relate to a relationship with someone where one party is totally dominant and doesn't leave space for the other person, and how that relationship becomes abusive and impossible and toxic. And any relationship, any technology, that our relationship with that has the same dynamic. And so unless it can create space for us, and indeed we create space for it, and have moments of standing back from it, we're going to be lost within it.
Great, thank you.
Okay, next question.
Thanks, Harris. That was great. I
As someone who's had the privilege of experience Shabbat for many years, then I can appreciate all the positives that you have outlined here today. Why do you think that people find it difficult, though, to set things aside? Like, if we focus only on the benefits that we have, then it seems kind of obvious that this is the kind of thing we ought to think about doing, is to provide that distance, to have that freedom and space for creativity. But there's clearly a part of us that also finds it really challenging. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about why people might be resistant.
I mean, the word that came into my mind as you were talking was psychology. I think that we inherently, and I'm kind of getting a little bit Buddhist here, we're grasping, we're always desiring. Our hands are always reaching out. We want experience. We want it. We also want it. We want quick fixes. We want it now. And I talk about my own experience of keeping Shabbat. It's actually really hard. You get to the moment. I mean, it comes in at a particular minute, right? And it changes during the course of the year as the evenings, get earlier or later, the daylight. And then you're on the phone like a minute before, and you think, okay, I need to stop now. And it's very hard. And what's incredible is how my addiction, I'm talking personally here, comes back the second it's over. The second it's over, my whole family, we reach for our phones, and we have this hour of frantic scrolling where we think something really important's happened over the last 24 hours, even though it's a weekend. And we discover a few hours later, after looking at videos of kittens and the rest of it, that actually nothing's happened in the world that we actually need to really engage. I think our psychology is such that it's really, really difficult. And so we resist this with everything we have.
We'll try from one side of this room. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for that. There were lots of echoes for me of a great deal of the literature on Christian attitudes to the theology of work. And one of the echoes came when you quoted a document, I think, called something like The Virtues of Work Apart from Money. We tend to make that mistake too, of forgetting how important money is, or at least the wherewithal for survival. And as you indicated, in previous industrial revolutions, or whatever you call it, the promise of more leisure has been held out. What's actually happened is that some people are worked harder and others are made redundant. And in an age of, which I would characterize really as even ever more extreme social Darwinism, that redundancy is being increasingly talked about as you should not exist. Do you think the consequence of that is that religious communities are going to have to find ways to enable some of their members to stay alive, and even some of their communities more widely, to counter the maldistribution of leisure that AI might create?
There's a lot in that. I mean, firstly, the problem of equality is a real one. Some people working, some people not. But when people are commenting on this, they're talking about actually all jobs being affected and everyone being affected. And I mean, I'm embarrassed that's my day job and a lawyer like Rachel here. And I'm preparing for court this week. And I thought, I'm going to use, there's a new AI aspect on this platform that we use for case searching. I'm going to use this to help me. And I was pretty blown away. And then I did use an LLM to summarize a little bit of my brief. I've never done that before. And it's amazing and very, very scary. And it writes better than me. And I could see a lot of my job being whittled down, if not maybe all of it at some point. Depends how far we want to go with this. We need to think what we actually want to leave for ourselves. Where are the red lines? And these are the kind of, you ask about on members of communities. I think, yes, there's a danger that unless we actually grapple with this and also advocate for it in the way that Beth's talking about, yes, we'll be in this quandary and we'll suffer. Yeah, and I do think all religions have resources for this. And I do think religions have thought very, very deeply about actually what it means to be human, apart from work, as we know it, and just making money. And I think we have to really dig quite deeply and in a sophisticated way, and we'll get there.
I'm going to play devil's advocate, so please forgive me. You talked about attention being the source of devotion. So if we think about it in a positive way, in artistic sense, what you pay attention to does become a process of devotion. But then you also said the minute Shabbat's over, you're on your phone, and that is also a way of being devoted to something. So I'm wondering, if we think about what we are devoted to in AI, is there something we can learn from that? This devotion, this attention, the time that we give it as a reflection of ourselves?
I think attention, I don't think I mentioned that word, but actually you're right to sort of read it in there, because sometimes I kind of think, what is when I delve into the question of what's left to us, attention comes up as being one of those. I mean, experience is the other thing we all experience, right? But where we place our attention is another big sort of thing, which is currently in our power, sort of. Going back to Claire's point, it's being pulled in all different directions, and I think that really is the key. Like AI can help us if we impose our attention on it. In other words, think about just an LLM model. If you have an interest in a particular area, you want to play the piano, right? And you can focus your attention on that and use technology in that way. And there's a difference between that and then letting AI and other technologies like social media distract you and take your attention elsewhere. And I think, in terms of education and preparing ourselves for this world, gaining control over our attention, both in terms of where, understanding our values, where we want to put it, and also finding mechanisms, actual ways to actually be able to overcome the desires and the distractions, to be able to focus that, I think, is key in educating ourselves and preparing ourselves for the world that we're inhabiting. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. That was excellent. I really like the connections that you made between creation, freedom, and tools. I wonder if you could go back to that slide and say, you had I think there was 4 points. Say a little bit more about that. I thought that was quite profound.
That's this one. Okay. There's a risk of repeating myself. I mean, essentially, there's 4 ideas, but each one comes from a different place. So the first one comes from the commandment within the 10 Commandments, where we're told that God created the world and then rested, and that becomes the reason for Shabbat. So there's a direct connection between creation and pause. And then one has to then try and think about the connection between creativity and pause. Silence is part of creation. And as I said in my slide, I offered this homily, as it were, and said essentially what it points to, the need to pause after creation, is that because the act of creation itself isn't just what creation is about. There's something beyond there which we're grasping towards. Whenever we create, there's something further that we're trying to reach. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 comes from the repetition of the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy, where actually the people were told to rest because they were slaves. So there's a connection there between slavery and the Shabbat. And I drew a connection there between slavery and freedom, suggesting that a slave can't really recognize in the midst of their slavery that they actually are enslaved, just as someone in an abusive relationship often needs someone else to come from the outside and say, this relationship you're in is not healthy. And so if we're enmeshed with technology, we don't see, in fact, what it does for us. Only when we step back and we say, okay, I'm addicted to my phone because I want to reach for it, and now I can feel that impulse. Number 3, I'm focusing on a specific law about moving tools, which the rabbis imposed. It's not a biblical rule, just as a kind of ring fence. They actually called it a fence. And what putting a tool aside means, and I drew the connection with Heidegger. And then the final one was this notion, the Kabbalistic notion of withdrawing oneself to leave space for the other. As I say, it's a notion we all know from any relationship we have. AI is a powerful thing. God is a powerful thing. And within the Jewish tradition, God needs to withdraw. You need to have absence from God for us to be who we are. AI, and same thing, it also has to have spaces built in, and that's the humble AI piece. I hope that clarification is helpful. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I think we're out of time at this point, but
Okay.
thank you,
Thank you.
Harris.